Imagine a land where gods walked among mortals, where the Nile gave life to one of the most remarkable civilizations the world has ever known. We often picture this world ruled by men in crowns of gold, leading armies and carving their names into stone for eternity. But what if that image is incomplete? What if some of Egypt's most daring, visionary, and resilient rulers were women whose legacies stretched far beyond the myths we know? When people think of a queen of Egypt, one name rises above all others: Cleopatra. She has been immortalized in plays, films, and stories, painted as a seductress, a political genius, and a tragic heroine. Yet, Cleopatra's reign, as extraordinary as it was, is only one chapter in a much deeper story. Before her, and even after her memory began to dominate history, there were women who claimed the throne of Pharaoh with authority and brilliance. These women were not simply caretakers of power for sons or brothers. They became kings in their own right, reshaping politics, religion, and culture in ways that still astonish scholars today. Some of their names, like Hatshepsut and Nefertiti, are slowly returning to the spotlight, while others, like Twosret and Sobenferu, remain hidden in the shadows of time, waiting to be rediscovered. Their stories are filled with ambition, struggle, triumph, and the deliberate attempts of later generations to erase them from memory. What makes their legacies so compelling is not just the grandeur of temples or the intrigue of palace politics. It is the way these women challenged the very idea of what it meant to rule. They remind us that history is not fixed, that power is not bound to one gender, and that the voices we hear most loudly are not always the only ones that mattered. Welcome to our channel, Words of Time, and in this video we are going to uncover the myth of sole rule. Beyond the serpent queen Cleopatra, we will explore the fascinating lives of Egypt's forgotten female pharaohs, their triumphs, their struggles, and why their stories matter just as much today as they did thousands of years ago. When we think of ancient Egypt, the name that comes to mind most often is Cleopatra. She is remembered as the last ruler of a dynasty that had already lasted for centuries, and her story is told again and again as if it defines the entire experience of women in power along the Nile. Cleopatra's fame rests not only on her rule, but also on her dramatic life and death, the politics she navigated with Rome, and the love affairs that history has elevated to legend. From plays by Shakespeare to films of the 20th century, she has been presented as the embodiment of Egyptian queenship, the seductress who wielded her beauty and cunning as much as her authority. Yet this familiar image hides more than it reveals. Cleopatra was far from the only woman to rule Egypt, and in fact she was not the first nor the most groundbreaking. Her prominence overshadows a much longer tradition of female power that stretches back thousands of years before her birth. Cleopatra became a symbol because her life unfolded at a time when the Mediterranean world was turning toward a new political order. Rome was rising, Egypt was waning, and her struggle against that tide is one reason her name survived in Western memory. But to see her as the only woman who ever held real power in Egypt is to fall into a myth that Egyptologists have been challenging for generations. The truth is that Egypt allowed women a place in politics and religion unlike most other ancient societies. Women could be pharaohs, regents, and high priestesses. Some commanded armies, some reorganized the state, and some rebuilt temples that still stand today. Their names are less well known, but their impact was enormous. Long before Cleopatra, one of the earliest known women to hold royal authority was Mernith of the First Dynasty, around 5,000 years ago. Her exact role is debated, but she appears to have acted as regent for her young son. Archaeological evidence from her tomb suggests she was buried with honors befitting a king. She set a precedent that when a dynasty was unstable or when heirs were too young to rule, women could step forward to preserve the throne. Her existence shows that the roots of female power in Egypt reach back to the very beginnings of pharaonic history. Centuries later, in the Middle Kingdom, queens such as Sobenferu made history in even clearer terms. Sobenferu was the first woman we can say with certainty ruled as pharaoh in her own right. She took on the full titulary of kingship, wearing the regalia and performing the rituals. Her reign was short, but she managed to stabilize Egypt at the close of the 12th dynasty. What is remarkable is not only that she ruled, but that she was accepted. In many other cultures of the time, the idea of a woman wearing the crown of the supreme ruler would have been unthinkable. In Egypt, however, religious ideas about kingship allowed for some flexibility. The pharaoh was the earthly representative of the gods, a divine role that could, when circumstances required, be filled by a woman. Sobenfer's legacy is often forgotten, yet she stands as a landmark in world history, one of the first women to govern a centralized state as sovereign. If Sobenfer broke the path, Hatshepsut expanded it beyond recognition. Her reign in the 18th dynasty is one of the most fascinating chapters in Egyptian history. She began as regent for her stepson, Thutmose III, but eventually declared herself pharaoh. To secure her authority, she adopted the full imagery of kingship. In statues and reliefs, she appears in the male regalia, sometimes even with the ceremonial false beard. This was not an attempt to deny her womanhood, but a statement that she occupied the role of pharaoh fully and completely. Her reign was long and prosperous, marked by grand building projects, including her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, one of the architectural wonders of Egypt. She also re-established trade networks that had withered, sending expeditions to Punt and beyond. Under her leadership, Egypt flourished economically and culturally. For a time, her memory was almost erased, likely due to political motives after her death, but archaeology has restored her to the prominence she deserves. Hatshepsut was not just a caretaker ruler, but a visionary monarch who expanded Egypt's reach and left monuments that other women rose in moments of crisis when the state needed stability. Twosret, the last ruler of the 19th dynasty, took power after the death of her husband and stepson. She reigned as pharaoh in her own right during a turbulent period. Although her time on the throne was marked by conflict, she was buried in the Valley of the Kings, a sign of her acceptance among royal predecessors. Later dynasties would see other women hold sway, not always with the title of pharaoh, but as regents or power brokers behind the throne. These women demonstrate that Egypt had a long tradition of granting women exceptional roles when circumstances demanded it. One figure who deserves greater recognition is Ahotep, queen of the 17th dynasty, who lived during the wars of liberation against the Hyksos invaders. She is remembered for rallying troops and even leading armies in the absence of her husband and son. Inscriptions honor her as one who cared for Egypt's soldiers and restored order. She bridged the transition to the new kingdom, when Egypt would become an empire. Without her, the unification that allowed the great pharaohs of the 18th dynasty to emerge might never have been possible. Her role reminds us that leadership was not always confined to the throne. Sometimes queens acted as generals, guardians, and symbols of national survival. In later centuries, the Ptolemaic dynasty into which Cleopatra was born continued to see powerful queens. The dynasty itself had a tradition of joint rule, where queens often played visible and active roles alongside kings. Cleopatra's own ancestors included queens who co-ruled, influenced politics, and sometimes even overshadowed their husbands or brothers. Cleopatra's brilliance lay in her ability to harness this tradition while engaging with the new realities of Roman expansion. She was multilingual, highly educated, and politically shrewd. But what sets her apart in memory is the drama of her downfall. The battle against Octavian, her alliances with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, and her suicide by poison or snakebite created a story so striking that later generations could not forget it. Yet her fame came at the cost of forgetting the many women who ruled before her. The myth of Cleopatra as the only or the first woman of power in Egypt persists because history often prefers simple narratives. It is easier to tell the story of one queen who captivated Rome than to explore the complex tradition of female leadership that spanned millennia. But when we take the time to study queens like Mernith, Sobenferu, Hatshepsut, Ahotep, Twosret, and others, we discover that Cleopatra was part of a continuum, not an exception. These women challenge our assumptions about gender in the ancient world. They show that Egypt was, in some ways, more flexible than Greece or Rome when it came to women in power. While Athens excluded women from politics and Rome limited their influence, Egypt allowed them to step onto the throne itself. The contributions of these women were not only political, but also cultural and religious. Queens often played central roles in temple rituals, ensuring the favor of the gods. Some sponsored massive building programs that reshaped Egypt's landscape. Others maintained stability in times of succession crises. Their reigns remind us that Egypt's longevity as a civilization, stretching over 3,000 years, was not built on the efforts of men alone, but on the shared contributions of men and women who rose to the challenges of their age. Cleopatra's story is captivating, but it is just one chapter in a much larger book. To understand the true history of Egypt, we must look beyond the Serpent Queen and recover the lives of her predecessors. Doing so allows us to see Egypt not as a land where one extraordinary woman happened to seize power, but as a civilization where female authority was woven into the fabric of society. This recognition does not diminish Cleopatra, but places her in her rightful context. The last in a long line of women who proved that leadership in Egypt was never the sole domain of men. The more we study these women, the more we see how their legacies echo through history. Hatshepsut's temple still draws visitors who marvel at its design. Sobekneferu's reign stands as a landmark in the evolution of kingship. Ahotep's courage reminds us that even in war, queens could lead. Twosret's burial in the Valley of the Kings confirms her status among Egypt's rulers. These are not footnotes, but essential parts of the story. Cleopatra's fame can serve as a doorway, but once we step through, we should explore the full expanse of female leadership in Egypt. The myth of sole rule, the idea that only Cleopatra mattered, is convenient but false. The reality is richer, more complex, and more inspiring. It challenges us to question how history is written, whose stories are remembered, and whose are left behind. By bringing these queens back into the narrative, we not only honor their achievements, but also gain a clearer understanding of the civilization they shaped. Egypt was not just the land of pyramids and pharaohs. It was a land where women could, and did, sit upon the throne of Horus, with a double crown, and rule in their own names. To remember only Cleopatra is to see a ripple and miss the vast ocean that lies beneath. Hatshepsut stands as one of the most extraordinary figures in the long history of Egypt. Among all the women who rose to the throne, her reign offers perhaps the clearest example of how a queen could transcend the limitations of gender and become a fully recognized pharaoh. She was not content to act merely as regent or caretaker until her stepson came of age. Instead, she transformed herself into king, adopting the titles, symbols, and rituals that had long been reserved for men. In doing so, she reshaped not only the politics of her age, but also the very idea of kingship itself. Hatshepsut began her rise to power in the early part of the 18th dynasty, one of the most vibrant eras in Egyptian history. She was the daughter of Thutmose I and became the wife of her half-brother, Thutmose II. When her husband died, his heir, Thutmose III, was still a child. As queen mother and regent, Hatshepsut initially held power on his behalf, a role that many royal women had played before her. But after a few years, she made a bold and unprecedented decision. Instead of waiting for the boy to mature, she declared herself pharaoh. She did not abandon her role as regent, but absorbed it into a new identity as ruler in her own right. To legitimize this move, she carefully crafted an image of herself that balanced tradition with innovation. One of the most striking aspects of her reign was her deliberate use of male regalia and titles. In statues and reliefs, she appears wearing the name's headdress, the false beard, and the kilt that were part of traditional royal imagery. She referred to herself with the masculine word for king rather than the feminine queen. This was not, as some earlier scholars mistakenly believed, an attempt to disguise her gender. Rather, it was a symbolic statement. The office of pharaoh was greater than gender, and whoever held it was transformed into a figure beyond ordinary categories. By embodying both her womanhood and the full iconography of kingship, Hatshepsut created a new model for rule that would resonate long after her death. Her reign was marked by peace, stability, and prosperity, qualities that allowed her to focus on projects that would define her legacy. Unlike rulers whose names are remembered for conquest, Hatshepsut is remembered for creation. She embarked on an ambitious program of building that surpassed anything attempted by her predecessors for generations. Across Egypt, she ordered the construction or restoration of temples, shrines, and monuments. She sought not only to strengthen her legitimacy by inscribing her name into sacred spaces, but also to leave a tangible mark on the land of Egypt itself. The most celebrated of her works is her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, located on the west bank of the Nile near Thebes. This complex, known in ancient times as Djeser-Djeseru, meaning the most sacred of sacred places, stands as a masterpiece of architecture. Built into the cliffs with a series of terraces and colonnades, it seems to grow out of the natural landscape. Its design departed from the massive, block-like structures of earlier times and introduced a sense of harmony with the environment. The temple served as both a place of worship and a monument to her reign, with reliefs depicting her divine birth and her great achievements. Among the most famous scenes are those that recount the expedition to the land of Punt, a distant region rich in incense, gold, and exotic goods. These reliefs show detailed images of the people, animals, and goods brought back to Egypt, offering not only a glimpse into trade, but also a proud celebration of prosperity under Hatshepsut's rule. The expedition to Punt itself is one of the great achievements of her reign. Egypt had not engaged with Punt on such a scale for centuries, and by reopening this connection, Hatshepsut reinvigorated Egypt's economic and cultural horizons. Incense was especially important for temple rituals, and by ensuring a steady supply, she strengthened the religious foundations of her kingship. This focus on trade, wealth, and the temple economy shows how Hatshepsut understood power, not only as military might, but as the ability to nourish the gods, the land, and the people. Beyond Deir el-Bahari, Hatshepsut left her mark at Karnak, the great temple complex dedicated to Ammonius. She added obelisks of impressive height, one of which still stands today, a testament to her ambition and skill. These obelisks were carved from a single piece of granite and transported from quarries at Aswan, an engineering feat of astonishing difficulty. By raising such monuments in honor of Ammonius, she tied her reign directly to the power of the chief god of Thebes, reinforcing her legitimacy in religious as well as political terms. Her rule was long by the standards of Egyptian queens, lasting over 2 decades. During this time, Egypt enjoyed a level of peace that allowed resources to be directed toward culture rather than war. While Thutmose III would later embark on a series of military campaigns that extended Egypt's empire, Hatshepsut's legacy is of consolidation, stability, and prosperity. This duality, her peaceful reign followed by his conquests, created a balance that shaped the trajectory of the 18th dynasty. Yet Hatshepsut's story does not end with her death. What makes her memory so compelling is the attempt to erase it. Years after she died, and after Thutmose III had taken full control, efforts were made to remove her name and image from monuments. Inscriptions were defaced, statues were smashed, and her cartouches were chiseled out. For centuries, her existence was almost lost to history. Scholars once believed that Thutmose III did this out of hatred or revenge, but more recent interpretations suggest it may have been part of a broader attempt to present an unbroken line of male kings. By erasing Hatshepsut, later rulers could claim continuity without acknowledging the unusual episode of a woman holding the throne as king. Whatever the motive, the result was effective. Hatshepsut vanished from the historical record for millennia. Her rediscovery came with the rise of modern Egyptology in the 19th century. As archaeologists explored the ruins of Deir el-Bahari and pieced together fragments of statues and inscriptions, the figure of a female pharaoh emerged. At first, the idea seemed almost unbelievable. Early scholars struggled to reconcile the evidence of a woman wearing the beard of a king. But as more discoveries accumulated, her reign came into focus. By the 20th century, Hatshepsut was recognized as one of the greatest rulers of ancient Egypt. The irony is that the very attempt to erase her may have preserved her in another way, as the mystery of her disappearance drew attention to her once-forgotten story. Hatshepsut's rediscovery has profound implications for how we understand both Egypt and the role of women in history. She was not a footnote, not an anomaly to be brushed aside, but a ruler who presided over one of the most prosperous periods in the New Kingdom. Her achievements challenge assumptions about gender and power in the ancient world. They show that Egypt, unlike most contemporary societies, could embrace the authority of a woman when she demonstrated skill, vision, and devotion to the gods. She also forces us to think critically about how history is recorded and remembered, whose names are preserved and whose are erased. How much of our understanding of the past is shaped not by what happened, but by what was allowed to survive in inscriptions and monuments. In modern times, Hatshepsut has become an icon of female leadership, admired for her ability to transcend boundaries and assert her authority in a world dominated by men. Yet it is important not to impose modern categories too neatly upon her. She did not rule as a feminist revolutionary, but as a pharaoh deeply embedded in the traditions of her culture. Her success lay in her ability to use those traditions to her advantage, reshaping them to include herself without overturning the sacred structures of kingship. This subtle blend of innovation and conservatism is what made her reign both acceptable in her time and remarkable in ours. The story of Hatshepsut, then, is not simply the story of a woman who became king. It is the story of how Egypt, with its deep religious and political traditions, allowed for such flexibility when the moment required it. It is the story of a ruler who left behind monuments that still inspire awe, who brought wealth and stability to her land, and whose memory was nearly obliterated only to rise again through the work of modern discovery. In the long line of Egyptian queens and pharaohs, she stands as one of the brightest stars, a reminder that the history of Egypt cannot be told through the names of men alone. Her reign also sets the stage for how later queens, including Cleopatra, would be understood. While Cleopatra became famous for her entanglements with Rome, Hatshepsut's fame rests on her accomplishments within Egypt itself. She demonstrates that women did not need foreign alliances to prove their power. They could build legitimacy from within by harnessing the religious, economic, and cultural foundations of Egyptian life. This contrast highlights the diversity of female rule in Egypt, showing that there was no single model, but many pathways to authority. As we move deeper into the stories of other queens, we see how each one navigated the particular challenges of her age. Some, like Ahotep, wielded power in war. Others, like Sobenferu, held the throne during moments of dynastic crisis. Hatshepsut, by contrast, represents the heights of peace and prosperity, the flourishing of art and architecture, the subtle genius of turning regency into kingship. Her rediscovery allows us to appreciate that Cleopatra was not the first nor the only great queen of Egypt, but part of a much longer and richer tradition. To place Hatshepsut back into the story is to recognize that Egyptian history is not a tale of one serpent queen at the end, but of many women whose reigns were ripples building into waves across 3,000 years of civilization. Nefertiti is one of the most recognizable figures in world history, her name forever tied to the graceful bust that now stands in Berlin. With her long neck, elegant features, and blue crown, she has come to symbolize the very image of beauty and Egyptian sophistication. Yet her importance goes far beyond aesthetics. Nefertiti was more than a queen consort. She was a partner in one of the most radical religious and cultural revolutions Egypt ever experienced. To understand her story is to step into one of the most fascinating and controversial chapters of Egyptian history, the Amarna period. It was a time of bold experimentation when the boundaries of tradition were stretched, and Nefertiti stood at the very center of that storm. She lived during the reign of Akhenaten, a pharaoh who is remembered for abandoning the age-old pantheon of gods in favor of a single deity, the Aten, represented as the sun disk. This was a profound shift. For over 1,000 years, Egypt had flourished under a polytheistic system where gods such as Ammonius, Osiris, Isis, and Horus played central roles in state and personal religion. By elevating the Aten to supreme status and diminishing the importance of other gods, Akhenaten restructured not only worship but also political authority. The temples of Ammonius, which had grown wealthy and powerful, were marginalized, while the royal family positioned itself as the unique intermediaries between the Aten and humanity. In this dramatic new order, Nefertiti was not a silent bystander, but a visible, active participant. Reliefs and inscriptions from the period portray Nefertiti in ways that are unprecedented for a queen. She is shown not just as a supportive consort, but as an almost equal figure to Akhenaten. Together they are depicted offering sacrifices to the Aten, raising their children under the rays of the sun disk, and receiving blessings directly from the god. In some scenes, Nefertiti is portrayed alone, performing acts of devotion that previously would have been reserved only for the king. Her prominence in these images suggests that she was not only beloved, but politically indispensable. In fact, the Amarna period could be described as a kind of dual rule, a partnership in which Nefertiti shared the stage of kingship more fully than any queen before her. The artistic style of this period further emphasizes her uniqueness. Traditional Egyptian art had been formal, idealized, and rigid for centuries. Under Akhenaten and Nefertiti, the style shifted toward a more fluid and naturalistic form. Figures were depicted with elongated limbs, full lips, and sloping faces. The royal family was shown in intimate domestic scenes, playing with children or enjoying each other's company, a striking departure from the timeless formality of earlier portrayals. Nefertiti's bust captures this artistic revolution. Created by the sculptor Thutmose, the bust was never meant as a public display, but as a model for workshops, yet it became one of the most iconic artifacts of antiquity. Its enduring power lies not only in its beauty, but in what it represents. A moment when Egyptian art embraced individuality and expression, and when a queen's image could embody the ideals of an entire age. Yet behind this cultural flowering lay great upheaval. Akhenaten's religious revolution disrupted centuries of tradition and provoked resistance. By elevating the Aten and reducing the roles of other gods, especially Ammonius, he challenged the power of the priesthood and destabilized the balance between religion and state. This was not a minor adjustment, but a seismic change that reoriented Egyptian society. Nefertiti's presence in this project was essential. She embodied continuity and legitimacy, grounding the new order in familiar royal authority even as it overturned the old ways. Without her, Akhenaten's vision might have appeared too radical, too divorced from tradition to succeed. With her, it carried the weight of a royal couple who presented themselves almost as divine figures on earth. As the years passed, Nefertiti's role appears to have grown. Scholars debate whether she became co-regent during the later years of Akhenaten's reign, sharing the throne as an equal ruler. Some inscriptions suggest that she took on a new royal name, Nefertiti, a titulary that has sparked endless discussion. The evidence is fragmentary, and scholars disagree on whether this refers to Nefertiti, another royal woman, or even a young male successor. But the possibility that she was elevated to co-regency is consistent with the extraordinary prominence she already enjoyed. If this interpretation is correct, Nefertiti was not only queen but king, one who stood alongside Akhenaten as co-sovereign. The question of what happened after Akhenaten's death deepens the mystery. The end of the Amarna period is one of the most obscure moments in Egyptian history. Records were deliberately destroyed or altered, leaving modern historians to piece together the story from broken inscriptions and scattered fragments. Some theories hold that Nefertiti ruled briefly on her own after Akhenaten's death, perhaps under the name Nefertiti or even Smenkhare. Others believe she may have died before him, vanishing from the record because of political turmoil. There is no consensus, but the speculation itself reveals the extraordinary status she achieved. The idea that she could have reigned alone, even for a short time, would have been unthinkable for most queens, yet entirely possible for Nefertiti because of the power she had already demonstrated. What is certain is that her influence did not end with her lifetime. The artistic and religious experiments of the Amarna period left a lasting imprint, even after Egypt returned to traditional worship. The Amarna style influenced later representations, softening the rigid idealism of earlier art. The emphasis on intimacy, individuality, and the central role of the royal family resonated even in eras that rejected Akhenaten's theology. Nefertiti's bust, created as part of this movement, has ensured that her image survived long after her name was nearly erased. Ironically, what was once a workshop model became the symbol of an age, elevating her to immortality in a way that no king or queen could have planned. Her story also illuminates the challenges of interpreting history when records have been deliberately obscured. The Amarna period was so controversial that later rulers attempted to erase it from memory. Akhenaten was labeled a heretic, his city abandoned, his monuments defaced. Nefertiti, too, was caught in this erasure. For centuries, little was known about her beyond fragments. Her rediscovery, like that of Hatshepsut, depended on the work of modern archaeologists piecing together what had been lost. Each new find, a cartouche, a statue, a line of text, adds to the puzzle, but the full picture remains elusive. In this way, Nefertiti embodies both the brilliance of Egyptian history and the fragility of historical memory. It is tempting to view Nefertiti primarily through the lens of beauty, as the bust encourages us to do. Yet to do so diminishes her true importance. She was not merely the beautiful face behind a revolutionary king. She was a partner in power, a possible co-ruler, and perhaps even a ruler in her own right. Her legacy lies in the religious daring of the Amarna period, the artistic transformation that reshaped Egyptian aesthetics, and the enduring image of a queen who, thousands of years later, still captivates the world. In this sense, Nefertiti's influence extends beyond her lifetime, beyond even the borders of Egypt, into the global imagination of what power, beauty, and leadership can mean. When we place Nefertiti in the broader story of Egyptian queens, a pattern emerges. Like Hatshepsut before her, she blurred the boundaries between queen and king, pushing the limits of what was possible for a woman in a role traditionally reserved for men. Unlike Hatshepsut, who grounded her power in stability and tradition, Nefertiti staked her claim on revolution, aligning herself with a new vision of the divine. Both approaches reveal the adaptability of Egyptian concepts of kingship. The institution was not rigid. It could accommodate innovation, even radical change, when embodied by leaders of extraordinary presence and ability. Cleopatra, centuries later, would confront her own set of challenges in a very different world. But she too drew upon this tradition of powerful queens who knew how to harness the symbolic and practical resources of kingship. The Amarna period reminds us that history is not only a tale of continuity, but of disruption. Nefertiti stands as a symbol of disruption that shaped a new kind of continuity. She shows us that beauty and power were not opposites but intertwined, that a queen could be both the icon of grace and the engine of revolution. Her bust, with its serene gaze and perfect balance, captures this paradox. It is at once timeless and utterly tied to a moment of upheaval. It is the face of a woman who changed Egypt, even if the details of how remain hidden in mystery. And it is through this mystery that her story continues to fascinate, inviting each generation to look closer, to question, and to imagine the full scope of her reign. In the larger narrative of Egyptian queens, Nefertiti adds another layer to the myth of sole rule. Cleopatra may be remembered as the last, Hatshepsut as the builder, but Nefertiti is remembered as the revolutionary. She and Akhenaten sought to rewrite the relationship between gods and humans, king and queen, art and tradition. Even though later rulers tried to erase them, their vision cannot be forgotten, because it challenged the very foundations of Egyptian society. Nefertiti, in particular, emerged not as a shadow behind a radical king, but as his equal and perhaps his successor. Her image, more than his, endures as the defining emblem of the age. Through her, we see how deeply Egypt could be transformed by the presence of a powerful queen, and how those transformations still echo in our understanding of the ancient world today. Twosret is one of those names that, unlike Cleopatra or Nefertiti, does not immediately resonate with most people outside of specialized studies in Egyptology. Yet her story is no less compelling, and in many ways it is even more poignant. She lived at the twilight of the 19th dynasty, a dynasty that had produced some of Egypt's most powerful and recognizable kings, such as Ramesses II. By the time she came to power, however, that line was fraying, burdened by succession disputes, economic strain, and political uncertainty. Into this storm stepped Twosret, a woman who dared to claim the throne as pharaoh in her own right, but whose reign became tangled in the very instability she sought to control. For centuries her memory was nearly erased, and only in recent decades has archaeology begun to restore her to her proper place in the long lineage of Egyptian rulers. Twosret was the widow of Seti II, one of the later kings of the 19th dynasty. After his death, she became regent for his heir, a young boy named Siptah. Acting as regent was not unusual for royal women in Egypt, as we have seen in the cases of earlier queens such as Mernith and Hatshepsut. What makes Twosret's case distinctive is that when Siptah died, she did not step aside for a male successor, but took the crown for herself. In doing so, she placed herself directly into the line of kingship, assuming all the titles and regalia that came with the role of pharaoh. In inscriptions, she is styled with the full titulary, including the Horus name, throne name, and birth name written in cartouches. Her decision to reign as king rather than queen regnant reveals both her ambition and the precedent set by women like Hatshepsut generations before her. Her reign, however, unfolded in troubled times. Egypt in the late 19th dynasty was far less stable than it had been under the great Ramesside kings of the past. There were disputes over succession, and powerful officials wielded as much influence as the monarch. The Chancellor Bey, a Syrian-born courtier, rose to extraordinary prominence during this era, serving under both Seti II and Siptah. Inscriptions describe him as the one who established the king on his father's throne, a phrase that suggests he was instrumental in shaping the politics of succession. Some scholars believe Bey may have acted as a kingmaker, and perhaps even as a rival power to Twosret herself. His execution during Siptah's reign points to the dangers and instability that marked the court. Twosret, who inherited this fractured landscape, faced not only the challenges of being a female pharaoh, but also the deeper problems of a dynasty in decline. Unlike Hatshepsut, who ruled in a period of prosperity and expansion, Twosret's reign was marked by contraction and uncertainty. Records from her time are fragmentary, and for a long while scholars knew little more than her name. Later king lists, compiled under the 20th dynasty, attempted to downplay her reign or omit her altogether. This was a political choice, part of the effort by the founder of the 20th dynasty, Setnecht, to legitimize his own rule by portraying Twosret as an illegitimate or failed monarch. As a result, her memory slipped into obscurity. What survived were scattered inscriptions, damaged monuments, and a tomb in the Valley of the Kings that was usurped by Setnacht after her death. These fragments were not enough to paint a full picture, but they hinted at a queen who had once claimed the throne in her own name, only to be lost to time. The erasure of Twosret reflects the vulnerability of female rule in moments of instability. When Hatshepsut was erased, it was partly an effort to maintain an unbroken male lineage, but her monuments were grand enough to survive that attempt. Twosret, by contrast, did not leave behind vast building projects that could secure her place in memory. Her reign was too short and too constrained by crisis to produce enduring monuments on the scale of Deir el-Bahari or Karnak. Without such visible markers, her legacy was easier to suppress. Yet recent archaeology has begun to shed new light on her story, allowing us to recover her from the shadows of history. One of the most significant pieces of evidence comes from her tomb, KV-14, in the Valley of the Kings. This tomb was originally begun for her husband Seti II and later adapted for Twosret's own burial. It is unusual in design, reflecting the complexity of her reign. After her death, Setnacht, the founder of the 20th dynasty, usurped the tomb for himself, altering inscriptions and replacing her name with his own. For a long time, this confused scholars, who debated whether Twosret was buried there at all. But detailed studies of the tomb's layers of decoration have confirmed her presence. The very act of usurpation demonstrates that she was once significant enough to require erasure. Setnacht could not simply ignore her memory. He had to overwrite it to secure his legitimacy. Other archaeological finds have added to the picture. Inscriptions from Nubia mention her name, indicating that she was recognized as ruler beyond the Nile Valley. A small number of scarabs and seals bearing her cartouche have been discovered, proof that she did issue royal objects in her own name. These may seem like minor traces compared to the colossal monuments of other pharaohs, but they are vital clues in reconstructing her reign. They confirm that Twosret was not a phantom ruler, but a legitimate pharaoh, however brief and contested her time on the throne may have been. The rediscovery of Twosret highlights the importance of archaeology in challenging the narratives handed down by later dynasties. Setnacht and his successors wanted to present themselves as restorers of order after a period of chaos. To do so, they minimized or erased Twosret's role. Modern historians, however, can see through these distortions. By examining the evidence with fresh eyes, they recognize her as the last pharaoh of the 19th dynasty, a woman who tried to assert control during a turbulent age, but whose reign was overshadowed by the rise of the 20th dynasty. She may not have achieved the enduring glory of Hatshepsut or the lasting fame of Cleopatra, but her courage in seizing the throne makes her part of the same tradition of powerful Egyptian queens. Twosret's story also raises broader questions about how we define significance in history. For centuries, she was dismissed as a minor figure, almost a curiosity. Yet when we consider the context of her reign, her importance becomes clear. She represented the last breath of a dynasty that had dominated Egypt for more than a century. She ruled at a moment when the old order was crumbling and new powers were rising. Her very attempt to take the throne shows how Egyptian society could still, even in its instability, accept the rule of a woman when the need arose. To view her as insignificant is to miss the point. Twosret was a ruler who stood at the edge of one dynasty and the beginning of another, bridging a critical transition in Egyptian history. Her rediscovery also reminds us of the fragility of memory. Cleopatra was remembered because her story intersected with Rome and entered the Western tradition. Hatshepsut was remembered because her temple and obelisks could not be entirely destroyed. Nefertiti was remembered because of a bust that survived the centuries. Twosret, by contrast, was almost forgotten because her traces were fewer, her monuments usurped, her name erased. Only the persistence of archaeologists and historians has brought her back into view. This pattern reveals how much of history is shaped not only by what happened, but by what endured in stone, papyrus, and later tradition. Twosret's survival into modern knowledge is a victory of evidence over erasure, a reminder that even the most obscure rulers can still speak through the fragments they leave behind. When we place Twosret alongside queens like Sobenferu, Hatshepsut, Nefertiti, and Cleopatra, we see the full spectrum of possibilities for female power in Egypt. Some ruled in times of prosperity, others in moments of crisis. Some left behind monumental legacies, others only faint traces. Yet all of them shared the courage to step into a role that was, in theory, designed for men. Twosret, in particular, embodies the difficulties of such a role when the state itself was unstable. Her story may not glitter with triumph, but it is essential for understanding the resilience and fragility of female rule in the ancient world. To forget her is to miss a key chapter in the long narrative of Egyptian queenship. Her reign also serves as a reminder of how dynastic cycles shape history. The 19th dynasty began with the vigor of great kings, but ended with uncertainty and division. Twosret was not the cause of that decline, but she inherited its consequences. Her reign is better understood not as a failure, but as an attempt to hold together a crumbling order. That she was unable to prevent the rise of the 20th dynasty does not erase her significance. On the contrary, it highlights her determination to rule in the face of overwhelming challenges. As more discoveries are made, our understanding of Twosret will continue to evolve. Excavations in the Valley of the Kings and the study of artifacts connected to her reign are gradually filling in the gaps. Each new find adds depth to the portrait of a woman who once sat upon the throne of Horus, ruling a land in turmoil, asserting her right to kingship even as the dynasty collapsed around her. The more we learn, the more she emerges not as a forgotten footnote, but as a pharaoh in her own right, part of the enduring tradition of Egyptian women who claimed the crown. In the flow of Egyptian history, Twosret represents both an end and a beginning. She was the last ruler of the 19th dynasty, and with her death or removal, the 20th dynasty took shape. Her reign may have been brief, but it was pivotal, marking the final chapter of one era and the uncertain dawn of another. To remember her is to acknowledge that Egypt's history was not only built by the famous names, but also by those who struggled in obscurity, whose legacies were buried under layers of politics and erasure. Twosret's story, once lost to time, is now being written anew, reminding us that even in the quiet shadows of history, the voices of powerful queens still echo across the centuries. The legacies of queens like Sobenferu, Hatshepsut, Nefertiti, Twosret, and Cleopatra form a tapestry that runs across thousands of years of Egyptian history. Each one stepped into a role that was both exalted and fraught with risk, each one leaving a mark that still shapes our understanding of how gender and power intersect in human societies. When seen together, their stories show us that the throne of Egypt was never the exclusive property of men, and that women were able, under the right conditions, to wield the ultimate authority of Pharaoh. Their collective impact is not measured only in monuments or military victories, but in the way they reshaped the possibilities of rule, expanded the boundaries of kingship, and influenced the cultural imagination of Egypt and later the world. What stands out first is the sheer range of contexts in which they ruled. Sobenferu took power at the end of the Middle Kingdom, stabilizing Egypt during a dynastic crisis and proving that the model of kingship could adapt to include a woman. Hatshepsut ruled during a time of prosperity and peace, transforming her regency into a full kingship and presiding over one of the most productive building programs in Egyptian history. Nefertiti rose to prominence in a revolutionary era when she and Akhenaten sought to remake religion and art, and she may even have held the throne in her own name. Twosret stepped into the vacuum of the late 19th dynasty, claiming the crown at a moment of chaos and dynastic collapse. Cleopatra, centuries later, navigated the dangerous waters of Roman expansion, fighting to preserve Egypt's independence until her final, tragic death. Taken together, these queens ruled in times of stability, upheaval, crisis, and decline, showing that female power in Egypt was not confined to a single moment or circumstance. It was a thread woven through the entire fabric of Egyptian civilization. The political impact of these rulers is clear. They maintained dynasties, rebuilt states, and in some cases reimagined the very structures of governance. Hatshepsut demonstrated that peace could be as powerful as war, using wealth and diplomacy to strengthen Egypt rather than military conquest. Nefertiti, through her partnership with Akhenaten, redefined the relationship between king, queen, and god, positioning the royal couple as the unique mediators of divine power. Twosret, though less successful in securing stability, exemplified the courage to assert authority in a collapsing system, proving once again that queenship could extend into kingship when dynastic survival demanded it. Cleopatra, with her mastery of languages, politics, and alliances, kept Egypt relevant in a world dominated by Rome, even if she could not ultimately reverse the tide of history. In each case, these women were not merely filling in gaps or holding places for male heirs. They were active, intentional rulers who made choices that shaped the course of Egyptian history. their cultural influence may be even greater. Hatshepsut's temple at Deir el-Bahari remains one of the architectural masterpieces of the ancient world, a site that still inspires awe in modern visitors. Nefertiti's bust has become an icon of beauty and art, instantly recognizable across the globe. Cleopatra has been immortalized in literature, theater, and film, her name synonymous with both power and allure. Even Twosret, whose legacy was long overshadowed, is beginning to re-emerge as archaeologists study her tomb and reconstruct her reign. These cultural footprints remind us that rulers are remembered not only for what they achieved in their lifetimes, but for how their images, monuments, and stories resonate across time. The religious dimension of their legacies cannot be overlooked. In Egypt, kingship was inseparable from divinity, and queens who became pharaoh had to situate themselves within this sacred framework. Hatshepsut crafted a narrative of divine birth to legitimize her kingship, portraying herself as chosen by Ammonius. Nefertiti stood alongside Akhenaten as the living embodiment of the Aten's blessings, their family depicted under the rays of the sun disk as if they themselves were divine figures. Even Cleopatra, in the Ptolemaic age, associated herself with the goddess Isis, merging her identity with a deity deeply revered in Egyptian religion. By aligning themselves with the gods, these queens not only legitimized their rule, but also expanded the ways in which kingship could be imagined. They demonstrated that divine authority was not bound to gender, and that a woman could embody the sacred role of pharaoh as fully as any. Yet perhaps the most enduring significance of their legacies lies in how they challenge the way history is told. For centuries, the dominant narratives of both ancient and modern historians have been shaped by male-centered perspectives. Women's contributions were often minimized, dismissed, or erased entirely. Hatshepsut's name was chiseled out of monuments, Nefertiti's role obscured by the collapse of the Amarna period, Twosret's reign overwritten by Setnacht, and the 20th dynasty, Cleopatra reduced in later Roman accounts to a caricature of seduction and decadence. What survives of these queens' stories is often fragmentary, filtered through the biases of those who followed them. Yet modern archaeology and scholarship have worked to recover their voices, demonstrating that they were not marginal figures but central actors in the story of Egypt. In doing so, these queens force us to question how many other women in history have been silenced or forgotten, their legacies erased by those who sought to control the narrative of the past. This is why their stories matter today. They remind us that power is not fixed in one shape, that leadership can take many forms, and that women have always been capable of ruling with strength, vision, and determination. They challenge stereotypes about ancient societies being uniformly patriarchal and show that Egypt, at least, was a place where female authority could rise to the highest level. In our own time, when questions of gender equality and representation continue to shape political and cultural debates, the example of Egyptian queens offers both inspiration and perspective. They demonstrate that the struggle for recognition is not new, and that the erasure of women from history is not inevitable but can be resisted and reversed. For modern women, these stories carry a particular resonance. Hatshepsut's decision to transform her regency into kingship speaks to the courage of stepping into authority when expectations say otherwise. Nefertiti's partnership with Akhenaten shows the power of collaboration and vision in remaking a society. Twosret's determination to claim the throne in a time of chaos illustrates resilience in the face of instability. Cleopatra's multilingual brilliance and political savvy reveal the importance of intellect and strategy in navigating a hostile world. These are not distant, irrelevant lessons. They are reminders that leadership has many faces, and that women throughout history have shown the ability to guide nations, shape cultures, and inspire generations. Beyond their specific examples, the very act of recovering their stories is important. Every time we uncover a forgotten queen, every time we restore her name to the list of pharaohs, we expand our understanding of what history truly is. It is not just the record of kings and battles, but the story of all who shaped the world. By remembering Sobenferu, Hatshepsut, Nefertiti, Twosret, and Cleopatra, we not only honor their achievements but also set a precedent for looking deeper into the past, for asking who else has been overlooked or silenced. Were there queens in other cultures whose names were erased? Were there women who led revolts, commanded armies, or guided their communities, but whose stories have been buried under centuries of neglect? The rediscovery of Egypt's queens invites us to keep searching, to question, and to listen for the echoes of voices long ignored. The collective legacy of these women also reshapes how we think about Egypt itself. Too often, Egyptian history is presented as a sequence of male rulers punctuated by monumental achievements: the pyramids, the conquests of Thutmose III, the reign of Ramesses the Great. By bringing the queens back into the picture, we gain a fuller, richer view of Egypt as a civilization that was flexible, dynamic, and capable of innovation in its understanding of power. Egypt's endurance over 3 millennia was not the product of male rulers alone, but of a system that could, when needed, embrace the authority of women who proved equal to the task. This adaptability was part of Egypt's strength, allowing it to survive crises, transitions, and even revolutions. As we reflect on their stories, it becomes clear that the myth of sole rule, the idea that Cleopatra alone represented female power in Egypt, does not hold up under scrutiny. She was part of a continuum, the last ripple of a much greater wave of queens who came before her. To reduce Egypt's queenship to Cleopatra alone is to miss the vast ocean of female leadership that preceded her. Hatshepsut's temples, Nefertiti's art, Twosret's contested throne, Sobenfer's groundbreaking kingship. All of these are part of the same story, each adding depth and complexity to our understanding of the ancient world. The unsung legacies of these queens matter today because they invite us to tell a different kind of history. A history that does not erase but recovers, that does not simplify but embraces complexity, that does not reduce women to side characters but recognizes them as central actors in the dramas of civilization. They matter because they remind us that the past is never as simple as the stories we inherit, and that by looking more closely, we can uncover truths that challenge our assumptions and expand our horizons. They matter because they continue to inspire, offering examples of courage, vision, and resilience that are as relevant now as they were thousands of years ago. The greatest tribute we can pay to these queens is not only to admire them, but to learn from them. To see in Hatshepsut's ambition, Nefertiti's daring, Twosret's determination, and Cleopatra's intellect the qualities that remain essential to leadership in any age. To recognize that history has always been richer and more varied than we have been told. And to carry forward the spirit of inquiry that has restored their names to us, asking always what other powerful figures, especially women, remain hidden in the shadows of time. Their stories are a reminder that history is not finished, that it is constantly being rewritten as we discover, remember, and reimagine the past. The legacies of Egypt's queens live on not only in stone and inscription but in the questions they inspire, the narratives they challenge, and the possibilities they open for us today.